Alex Vitale is a professor of sociology.
Vitale.
My bad. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Houston, and spent my whole childhood there. There was a moment, when Ted Cruz held my book up on the floor of the Senate during the confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court. And so I got a lot of interviews in newspapers, including my hometown paper, the Houston Chronicle, and I pointed out that unlike Ted Cruz, I was actually born and raised in Texas.
Where's Ted Cruz from?
He was born in Canada, and his parents are from
He's
Cuba.
Canadian?
Yeah. So he's not like the least bit Mexican-American or Tejano or...
Do you think he's kind of like playing that up?
Absolutely. Are you kidding? Yeah, of course. The surname is hugely important in Texas politics.
Why did he hold your book up?
To try to indict Ketanji Jackson Brown, the nominee for the Supreme Court, because evidently my book was being used at a school that she's on the board of. And it was, held up as an example of critical race theory infecting the minds of young people.
Do you associate your work with critical race theory?
I would say that my thinking has been influenced by critical race theory, which is a specific legal theory about how the criminal legal system works. I don't necessarily see my book as specifically a part of that, but I have no problem, being associated with it.
And when did you realize you wanted to focus on like police work?
That came later, because when I got out of college, I was doing urban policy. I was working at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness, working on housing policy for very poor people. How can we provide enough subsidy and enough new construction and all the rest to try to get people off the streets. But it was during this period in the early 90s where it seemed like cities had more or less given up on the possibility of really housing people on the streets and turned the problem over to the police. Turned it from a housing income crisis into a public order crime crisis.
What do you think about the phrase ACAB?
I don't use it. I know police, I work with police. I don't think it's helpful. It doesn't solve any problems for us.
And what was so attractive about that phrase to people?
People are angry because police are causing a tremendous amount of harm in our society. And it's a way of saying it's not about one or two bad apples, that it's a systemic problem. I agree it's a systemic problem, but it lacks nuance. It doesn't help us build broad political support for these ideas, and it's just not true. The truth is that the institution of policing is a tool that reproduces deep inequalities in our society, and we should get police out of our lives in as many ways as we possibly can.
Do you feel bad for cops?
I feel bad for people whose lives get turned upside down, even when they have some responsibility for it. I mean, I'd like to live in a world where less terrible things happen to people.
Has that ever happened in human history?
Well, it's never perfect, but it's different at different times and different places. We could make headway on this.
Do you think we need to abolish the Paw Patrol?
Yes, I do.
What'll happen to the dogs?
Someone else will animate them in new jobs.
And so why are we so obsessed with police?
I think because we have created a social order that rests on a tremendous amount of inequality and injustice. And policing is the tool we use to paper over that, to manage the consequences of that.
But does that explain our kind of romantic attachment to them?
Well, I think if you want to say why are there so many cop shows? I think you could take a kind of dramaturgical approach to that question and say, well, it's somewhat understandable because good drama requires conflict, and police are conflict workers.
So we structure our culture in a way that makes dramaturgical sense to us, because if we focused more on infrastructure and programs that gave people more access to a better life, that would be boring dramaturgically?
It could be that it's less interesting entertainment-wise, aesthetically. However, I do also think there's a crisis of imagination. There's there's just a tired formulaic reliance on policing.
No, or on the alternative, or on what's the better
Right.
What's the better thing to spend money on?
I've been working for the last 6 months out in Newark, New Jersey, where they've created this tremendous community-based violence reduction movement. It's very dramatic. They are preventing these shootings from happening. They are dealing with
Is this like the Steve James documentary, The Interrupters, like that kind of deal?
It's like that. It's
That's
exactly
cool.
like that.
Yeah, we need more of that.
We need more of that instead of cops.
Because there's a force to it. Like when they go in there
Yes.
and they put themselves in harm's way to prevent bad things
Yes.
from happening, there's still bravery, there's still determination.
And emotional stuff. I mean,
and emotional intelligence under those circumstances, which is
it's
very exciting.
So impressive. I could never do what those folks
I could do it. So you're saying it's actually very exciting to create structures that help channel our violent impulses into more communicative forms.
Or to reduce the impulsiveness and the aggression and the insecurity that might drive someone to engage in violence where they otherwise would not.
What percentage of violence do you think is based off insecurity?
In Newark, when they started doing this violence reduction work, they said, well, what are the homicides? Like, what's driving them? And what they found was that around 80% of them, it was just interpersonal beefs that escalated beyond what anybody involved really wanted. And it wasn't organized drug gangs, it wasn't armed robberies, it was people feeling insecure, so they're carrying a gun, then they get into a beef, and then the guns come out, and now you shot my friend, I'm gonna shoot your cousin, and then your cousin's brothers are gonna come get my brother, and so we could actually break that cycle.
Have you ever called the police?
Not in a long time.
Why did you call them?
I was stabbed.
How did you get stabbed?
Someone broke into my home.
And then you confronted them?
I was asleep and woke up with them. Yeah, I don't talk about this much.
Why did they stab you?
No idea. But I managed to get the knife from them and knock them over, and they took off.
Unbelievable. Were they ever caught?
Nope.
Do you have any ill will towards that person?
Ill will towards that person? I mean, confusion, and I wonder what was going on.
It's remarkable to me that you still have so much compassion for people who make those kind of mistakes, even though you've been on the wrong end of it.
Yeah.
Did that ever, challenge your kind of aspirational notions about...
No, when you talk to victims of violent crime, revenge is actually not, past the first 24 hours or whatever, is not the primary concern. They want some sense of security returned to themselves. They want what happened not to happen to anyone else. They would like to know why it happened, which of course the conventional criminal legal system doesn't really help with those things.
So why is it when we think about violence, we prioritize the body-to-body violence?
Well, it's immediate. It occurs in, like these shocking instances. The violence of high asthma rates in low-income communities of color, it doesn't have the same immediacy to it. And there's not like the other person on the other side of you that you immediately attribute the violence to. We watch all these cop shows, but there's another related genre that comes in and out of balance with the police shows that tells us something about the historical moment we're in, and that is private detective shows. If you think about the history of a lot of the good noir genre, it's about private detectives.
Yeah, Marlowe.
Because it's about exposing the seamy underworld that props up the social order that police are actually hired to maintain. And so the detective shows, the private detective shows, often put a face to the bad guy who's really causing the havoc, like Chinatown.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up with a lot of that. The 70s was an era with a lot of this really good detective stuff. And today, we don't have so much of that, though I feel like it's making a comeback. The Lincoln Lawyer, Goliath, these crusading lawyers, private
Those
detectives.
shows suck.
I like Goliath. Lincoln Lawyer is not so great. The first season was okay, the second season hasn't really held up. But it is possible to make these shows good.
Right, so in a cop show, they're generally punishing a criminal. But in a private detective film or TV show, they're finding the faceless violent guy and they're revealing him to the public.
Yes,
That's cool.
yeah. Even like the show Quincy, the medical examiner show.
These are all bad shows. Why is it less appealing to put a face towards kind of corporate violence or industrial violence?
I don't know if it's a question of appealingness, it's just more difficult because, first of all, those folks have resources to insulate themselves from scrutiny. But also they have a kind of ideological barrier that says, you know, I'm just a cog in the machine, which is often a smokescreen because they often knowingly make decisions that they know are unethical and even illegal, and that will have tremendous harms on people so that they can personally enrich themselves.
But we'll do that with drug dealers too, at least in art, where they'll always make a compelling argument towards the end of the film when they're about to be judged, where they're like, you want me, you need me, I'm a product of your system. I am American commerce come to life in the city and in the streets, but you'll put me in jail, but you won't put the corporate guy in jail.
I agree that there's a huge disconnect here. And what I want is not to put both of them in prison. What I want is real strategies to reduce the harms that both of them create.
What'll happen to the horses if we abolish the New York Police Department?
Well, there are a lot of places upstate where people keep horses, and I don't know, we'll retire them. They retire horses regularly from the police department.
Does anyone look into that?
I'm sure that people who raise horses have emotional understandings about horses.
Where do you stand on gun laws?
I grew up with guns in the house. I'm handy with a rifle. People in Canada have guns and never shoot each other. I would love to see an assault weapons ban. I would love to see restrictions on military type guns. I'd love to see some restrictions on handguns. But I think it's a mistake to think that the only viable strategy for reducing the shootings is through supply side gun control and gun interdiction strategies. To look at the demand side of the equation. It's like with drugs. We've tried stopping them at the border, stopping the drug dealers, interrupting the supply. It doesn't work. Turns out Americans love drugs. Well, there are lots of reasons why people carry guns, mostly around their own sense of insecurity. And we could do something about that.
That's smart.
In some ways, I'm like libertarian adjacent on some of this stuff, philosophically. Having state regulation try to fix these problems through punitive interventions in our everyday lives, it just doesn't work. And it's not desirable.
So you're talking about reducing interpersonal beef.
Yes. It's not that we're not going to have disagreements. It's that we can make them less lethal.
And what are the best ways to make them less lethal?
There's a variety of things, and they all kind of need to be done simultaneously, right? We need to give people access to mental health services to help them deal with the trauma they've already experienced.
Man, it's a tough one for me. So you're saying like some guy is pissed off at his buddy because he hasn't paid him back like the $500 he owes him on like a football bet.
Yeah.
And instead of this guy just going over there, banging on the guy's door and creating a situation that could escalate into violence, he should call one of these mental health places and they'll talk him through
No, it doesn't work quite like that. So in that situation, that's crisis response. So that requires real-time response on the streets involving people who are known to both parties, who can try to mediate the situation.
I'm believing this more.
Yeah. The mental health thing is what's happening in the background.
So you got someone you can call who's friendly to both of you, who can talk it out and come up with an outcome that works for both parties and prevents violence.
Yes.
You're talking about creating an institution that that produces glue guys.
Yes. And they have to have credibility in the community. They have to be known in the community.
They have to have cultural capital with the people
That's
around.
right. And they have to have a high level of emotional intelligence.
And you probably have to have grown up with that person.
That's right, more or less.
You got to know them from early.
The good news is that the communities that have the highest level of this kind of interpersonal violence tend to be less mobile, and everybody does know everybody. They're highly socially networked communities.
But that's also why the violence happens, because they're not
It's true.
mobile.
It's the irony, and they're connected. That's right.
Because otherwise you could be like, hey, it's not working, I'm going.
That's right.
That's why my old man, every time he goes through a breakup, he moves.
Yeah.
Is it also important that the violence interrupters have like a certain physical status so that they're not intimidating but able to go if they have to?
No. No. In fact, a lot of the violence interrupters now are women, and some of them quite diminutive. Now, they have credibility in the community. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the mobilization of violence, though in some cases it does, that historically they had been involved in violence. But the whole point is to take physical intimidation off the table.
You probably need someone who can throw.
You gotta have someone who understands that world.
Yeah, you know, that's more important for sure, and that should be the 1A of it, is that the person understands the psychology behind feeling like you have to throw.
Yes.
But you do need a physical deterrent.
That's not what I've seen.
Well, you haven't been in a bathroom in Cabo in 3 in the morning. But if it's gals, and then you get disrespected in front of a gal, that can also kick up more of that feeling that you need to throw.
Absolutely. Because we know emotionally, one of the primary drivers of homicides is humiliation. If you
Make someone
yell
look
at
weak
someone
to the community.
That's right. If it happens in the community, if it happens privately, it's easier to get past it.
We're fine.
Yeah. When we have information about like the emotional antecedents to homicidal violence, what shows up number one is humiliation. Not jealousy, not anger, it's humiliation.
Michel Foucault
I've heard of him.
famously explored the power relations between the state and the individual in Discipline and Punishment.
It's discipline and punish.
Discipline and Punish. Do you think that's still relevant?
I teach it. I think it has some insights. Foucault asks us a kind of an interesting question. He says, would you rather have social order produced by publicly torturing to death 25 people a year, or quietly and in a hidden way incarcerating 2 million people a year?
It's a great
and
question.
surveilling millions of others intensively and micromanaging their everyday activities?
I do understand the flaying the 25 people, though. It doesn't seem arbitrary to me. Because Bill the Butcher in Gangs in New York, he says, do you know how I control these disparate communities? Is the spectacle of violent events.
And that is basically the logic of all warlords. But it's hard to build a complex, dynamic society through a system of warlords.
Grenade launchers?
For school police forces.
No way.
Yeah, LA County School District Police had 1033 grenade launchers. They said they were repurposing them to launch tear gas. So, of course, that's much better.
So why do you think someone like Barack Obama extended like the 1033 program?
Well, so Obama tried to set some minimal limits to 1033, the transfer of military hardware, surplus hardware to civilian law enforcement. He said, oh, well, if it has turrets on the vehicle, then it's a tank and you can't have it. And if it's military grade weapons, you can't have them. But
It was
basically,
kind of superficial aesthetic limitations.
yeah, it can't be camouflage gear. So it was very superficial. Well, Obama is part of the same political consensus that Democratic mayors across the country are in, which is we don't have a solution to homelessness. We don't have a plan to do anything about substance abuse or mental health problems. We are not really even talking about problems of poverty, and we need policing to cover all these political failures up.
But are there any historical models that we can look to for inspiration?
Yeah, so there are lots of great examples. I mean, Portugal has decriminalized all drugs. It's not a policing matter anymore. It's understood as a public health issue, and the results have been fantastic. Are there still drugs? Yes. Do some people have bad experiences with drugs? Yes. But the number of overdoses has plummeted. The number of transmitted diseases through drug use has plummeted. Conditions in communities have improved. I was there 2 summers ago, and they've made tremendous headway in doing this. In the United States, life expectancy for everyone is declining almost exclusively because of opioid overdoses. They solved that problem in Portugal.
So by legalizing it, they created a system where people could get help if they went too far with it.
Yes. And you can check on what you're using, and it just takes the criminal legal system out of the equation in ways that allow it to be a public health issue. So there's access to drug treatment, safer consumption sites, clean needles, and all the rest.
Ice-T wrote a song called Cop Killer in response to police brutality, and then he played a cop on Law & Order SVU for a long time. If you could say anything to Ice-T right now, what would you say?
You're a sellout. I mean, not just Ice-T, Ice Cube, lots of black actors it's been made clear to them the only path to career security is to prop up the police state, is to play these roles, or the CIA state. So this is, if you're gonna be a successful black actor in Hollywood, you have to be part of the propaganda system. Refusing those kinds of roles is career suicide.
Suicide by cop.
Suicide by Hollywood producer.
Yeah, suicide by Hollywood producer.
Okay, Buster, why don't you go lay down?
Do you think you have more of an engine for sex than most intellectuals?
Absolutely have no idea.
You have no idea what your own engine is or how your engine compares to others?
How it compares to others.
If you had to self-define.
I'm getting older, you know. I'm sure there are young people who are far more ingenious.
Do you miss it? Do you ever feel trapped by your industrious attitude to fix the world?
I'm totally a workaholic, so it's a total effort to try not to lean into, you know, trying to fix everything all the time.
And why do you want to fix things?
Because I'd like to live in a world that feels safe and enjoyable, and where people don't have to worry about who they look at funny walking down the street, and where I don't have to see homeless people living in my neighborhood, where my kids don't have to worry about what's going to happen on the subway.
Does it seem futile to try and fix these problems?
It doesn't seem totally futile, just in the sense that we can look at examples when things have been better. It's not so hard to imagine, you know, some improvement. But ultimately, yeah, there's a kind of optimism of the will that is not entirely rational, but that's just the way I am.
Do you want a hug?
Sure.
You're a good guy.
I appreciate it.
You're doing good work.
Appreciate it.
I really did learn a lot.
Oh, good.